Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. If you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, we would love you to. And you can do so at patreon.com/the History Network. Thanks to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, Season 36, Episode 5, The Battle of Granicus. This episode was written by Murray Darm. Murray is an ancient and medieval military historian from New Zealand living in Australia. He has written more than 100 articles on various aspects of ancient and medieval military history, as well as other historical topics from all periods, ranging from the history of opera to the runic alphabet and recipients of the Victoria Cross. He is the author of Macedonian Phalangite versus Persian Warrior, Athenian Hoplite versus Spartan Hoplite, and Leuctra 371 BC, all from Osprey Publishing. He is, of course, a regular writer on here and a regular on the Ancient Warfare podcast. In the spring of 334 BC, the 22-year-old Macedonian king Alexander III, who reigned from 336 to 323 BC, not yet the Great, invaded the vast Achaemenid Persian Empire with an elite but small army of some 30,000 to 40,000 veteran infantry and only 5,000 cavalry. This invasion was the culmination of almost a century of pressure for some Greek commander or other to punish Persia for its own invasion of Greece during the 5th century BC. Persia had also continued to seriously meddle in Greek affairs thereafter, affecting the end of the Peloponnesian War in 404 BC and with the King's Peace in 386 BC. The mantle of leadership for this proposed invasion had passed from the Spartan king Agesilaus II reign circa 400 to 360 BC, to Athenian and then other Greek statesmen, and then to the Macedonian king Philip II reign 359 to 336 BC, who had all but conquered Greece in 338 BC at the Battle of Chaeronea. Philip, unlike his predecessors, took up the challenge. Philip had probably already begun plans for just such an invasion of Persia. But when he was assassinated in 336 BC, the responsibility for, and willingness to undertake, the invasion passed to his son Alexander. Alexander had commanded his father's cavalry at Chaeronea, so was already a veteran commander at the age of 18. He was not yet the Great, but his conduct on the invasion more than earned him the title, and kings and commanders ever since have sought to emulate him. With his relatively small invasion force, Alexander intended to conquer the immensity of the Persian Empire. According to our sources, the Persians could muster more than 1 million men against Alexander's tiny force. Most modern authors are highly sceptical about such numbers, but there is little doubt that Alexander was vastly outnumbered and marching entirely into hostile enemy territory. His first test would occur on the banks of the river Granicus, known today as the Biga-Key, in Çanakkale province, northwestern Turkey, a river which flows roughly north-south into the Black Sea. This is the best candidate, although there are others too, such as the Dimoktoka, a tributary of the Biga-Key. Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Persia in the spring of 334 BC, entering Persia with an army of veterans rather than young, inexperienced men. They had all campaigned in Greece and further afield under Alexander's father, and they had fought in Thrace and Greece under Alexander himself. He knew them and they knew him, factors which would contribute to them enjoying a decade of unprecedented success. Alexander had spent the previous 2 years ensuring that Greece and Thrace were pliant and loyal and would not contemplate rebellion while he was off conquering Persia. Most alarming, but no doubt most effective, was his razing the ancient city of Thebes to the ground in 335 BC. The message was clear: if you stand against Alexander, you will be punished. Macedonian phalangites made up the core of Alexander's army, organized into 6 divisions called taxes, singular taxis, of 1,536 men each, 9,216 men in total. Each was armed with a long sarissa spear between 4.5 and 7.3 meters long. Our sources disagree on the exact length, and no example has survived. These had a long blade and a butt spike called a saurota, literally a lizard sticker. The men also wore armour and carried shields, pelti, and swords. They would line up and advance 16 ranks deep, presenting thousands of deadly blades towards the enemy. The spear tips of the front 5 ranks protruded beyond the front rank, the others raised ready, and which perhaps offered some disruption to the missiles of their enemies. This well-drilled formation provided flexibility. In addition to being a potent attacking threat, the phalanx could also become an immovable anvil against which Alexander could strike with his cavalry forces as the hammer the enemy trapped between them. This tactic had been what Philip had achieved in Chaeronea, with Alexander commanding the cavalry, and it would be what Alexander would invariably attempt in his battles in Persia. Alexander, therefore, had a finely tuned and well-drilled phalanx, in addition to a combination of other units, such as the Hippospists, guard infantry, his own mercenary Greek hoplites, and specialized lightly armed troops, Agrianian and Thracian peltasts, who were mostly armed with javelins, Cretan archers, and others. These units helped protect the vulnerable flanks of the phalanx. In total, he had only 30,000 to 43,000 men. Again, different sources give different numbers. Leading the elite cavalry arm, made up of Macedon's young nobles, the 1,800 companions, was Alexander himself. In addition, he had cavalry contingents from Thessaly and other parts of Greece, amounting to a further 3,200 men. Alexander's arrival in Persia was, however, no surprise to the Persian governors, satraps of western Anatolia. Alexander's father Philip had made his intention of invading Persia plain, and soon after Philip's assassination in 336 BC, Alexander set about putting his father's plans in place. The satraps wasted no time in preparing to meet Alexander in battle. Once he and his army had crossed the Hellespont by ship, the satraps summoned their levies and met for a council of war at the city of Zelea, near modern Sarakoy, Balıkesir, Turkey. We are given the names of 14 commanders among the Persians, ranging from the satraps immediately affected or threatened to wealthy Persian landowners, as well as the Greek mercenary commander Memnon of Rhodes. Alexander moved quickly and headed directly towards the Persian mustering point. For the Persians, each commander would have levied troops in the area of responsibility, and then brought a number of Hazarabah of 1,000 men each, with each Harazabam led by a Hazarapatis, commander of 1,000. These were further divided into 10 Sataba of 100 men each. If each of the 14 named commanders brought on average 7 Hazabara, this gets us to 98,000 infantry. Each Persian commander would have brought a number of cavalry too. If each brought 1,500 cavalry, this brings us to 21,000, close to the 20,000 mentioned in the sources. Diodorus has only 10,000 cavalry present, each commander only needing to bring on average 700 cavalry. According to the historian Arrian, Usually regarded as our best surviving source for Alexander, Memnon counselled his employers to avoid facing the new Macedonian king in open battle because his army included a greater force of infantry. This probably meant heavy infantry, for the Persians certainly had many more infantry, but unlike their opponents, they were lightly armoured and predominantly used the bow and much shorter spears. The nobility provided the cavalry, and the Persians also employed Greek mercenary hoplites. They may also have had men of their own trained as hoplites, the Cardaces. Memnon advocated the employment of a scorched earth policy ahead of Alexander's troops, denying the invaders fodder by burning crops. Memnon's advice was ignored, however, and the Persian commanders sided with Arsaces, satrap of the Hellespontine Phrygia, in whose territory Alexander's force was present. Alexander was marching along the northern coast of Anatolia and advancing towards the Granicus River. Arrian tells us that the Persian army was made up of 20,000 cavalry and almost the same number of foreign mercenaries, although other sources give them between 100,000 and 600,000 infantry too. The Persians advanced from Zelea and took up a defensive position on the far side of the Granicus, and Alexander approached the river and the enemy across it. Reconstructing the Battle of Granicus is complicated by the fact that the surviving narratives, Arrian and the historian Diodorus, offer very different versions of the battle. Although he is often derided as the least trustworthy of our sources of Alexander, Diodorus' account of the battle actually makes the most sense. What follows, therefore, combines Diodorus' account with those of Arrian and our other sources, such as the biographer Plutarch. In the accounts of both Arrian and Plutarch, Alexander began the Battle of Granicus rashly, charging across the river at the Persians, either without support, Plutarch, and despite being massively outnumbered, both Arrian and Plutarch, leading his 1,800 companions against the Persian cavalry, 10,000 or 20,000 men. According to Arrian, Alexander's general Parmenion argued it was too late in the day to begin a battle and advised that they should make camp and attack in the morning. In Arrian's version, however, Alexander ignored this advice and immediately launched his attack. In his account of the battle, Plutarch mentions Alexander's attack as even more rash. There is no mention of a vanguard, as there is in Arrian. Only Alexander charged into the river with his companions, and persisting until he had forced a crossing. In each of these scenarios, Alexander was throwing away the strength and meticulous drill of his army, something honed over the previous 5 years and more. As such, this picture is extremely unlikely, and instead a more romantic and dashing, if entirely reckless and impetuous, image of the young king. Both Plutarch and Arrian were using the account of Aristobulus as a source, and this may explain the emphasis in their accounts. Aristobulus accompanied Alexander on campaign, although he is never mentioned as a commander or participant in any of the battles. Whilst it is true in all his battles Alexander placed himself in danger and was at the forefront of the Macedonian forces, leading charges at the head of his cavalry, his charges were never reckless or impetuous, but considered and well planned to create and then exploit a gap or weakening in the Persian line. What is more, such charges were always part of a known battle plan. The other components of his arm all had a part to play in that battle plan, and they knew their roles. The picture of the Granicus in Plutarch and Arrian would have Alexander throw all that meticulous planning away. Alexander's entire invasion would have come to an end had he fallen at the Granicus. Of course, that was always going to be a risk when the Macedonian king ran with his style of leadership in leading cavalry charges from the front, but it is an aspect of his behaviour which is perhaps deliberately overemphasized by Arrian and Plutarch, and perhaps in Aristobulus. Alexander did indeed lead from the front and was inordinately brave, that is clear, but the solid reliability of the Macedonian military machine was built on the dependability of the phalanx in both attack and defence. Alexander is highly unlikely to have engaged in a battle at the Granicus, his first against the Persians, where those aspects of the phalanx and its known strengths were not used because the phalangites' formation was necessarily disrupted because of the river crossing, or not brought to bear, since Arrian and Plutarch have it as almost solely a cavalry encounter. That leaves us with Diodorus Siculus's account. In contrast to Arrian and Plutarch, Diodorus offers much which is different, but his represents a more cohesive and credible story of the battle. It is worth remembering that Diodorus was writing some 200 years before both Arrian and Plutarch, so his may be a better picture, although he was still writing almost 300 years after the events he describes. Diodorus's account of the battle is also the longest that survives, and this additional detail bolsters the case for more attention being shown to his version of events. According to him, then, when Alexander reached the Granicus, the Persians were deployed on the high ground on the opposite bank. There is no reference to the advice of Parmenion that it was too late in the day or the other objections to battle. Diodorus simply states that Alexander and his forces crossed the river at dawn before the Persians could challenge the advance. Alexander must therefore have camped for the night, just as Parmenion in Arrian's account suggested he should. Arrian and Plutarch's battle takes place late in the day, Diodorus's at dawn. Diodorus states that the Persians deployed their cavalry in front of the Macedonian infantry. In Diodorus we are given a detailed deployment of the Persian cavalry, left to right, and then the Macedonians, not recorded in as much detail elsewhere. According to Diodorus, the Persian infantry, as in Arrian, were posted behind the cavalry and did not advance, the 10,000 cavalry being deemed sufficient to defeat Alexander's forces. The fact that the Persians deployed their cavalry in front of their own formation perhaps tells us that they had not faced a phalanx, or been told of its strengths, one which was designed to deal with the enemy cavalry, especially if they attacked head-on. In this Memnon of Rhodes could surely have told them, but he may have been ignored in this advice as well. In Plutarch, the Persian infantry were intermingled with the cavalry along the river bank to oppose the Macedonians. There are nonetheless aspects of Arrian's and Plutarch's accounts which can be used in conjunction with Diodorus's. Diodorus, for instance, does not include the vanguard attack mentioned in Arrian. Indeed, if we use Arrian's details but place them in a battle fought the following morning, when Diodorus places it, many of the problems of the battle are mitigated. According to Arrian, the first troops to enter the river were the prodromoi, horse guards, with the Paeonians commanded by Amyntas, along with one taxis of infantry, and Socrates' squadron of companion cavalry commanded by Ptolemy, son of Philip. Amyntas and Socrates' attack was conducted by cavalry supported by 1,500 infantry, either the hypaspists or the rightmost taxis of the phalanx, that of Perdiccas. Alexander then led his right wing of cavalry across the river. Persians were waiting across the river, their cavalry in front, and Alexander's predominantly cavalry force immediately came under sustained missile fire from the Persian cavalry stationed on the far bank, much of it in the form of javelins. According to Arrian, the entire Macedonian line then advanced across the river obliquely from the right. This took place while the initial Macedonian cavalry attack was engaged with the Persian cavalry on the far bank. By advancing his army in this way, Alexander ensured that his troops offered enough of a threat to the Persians on the opposite river bank that they could not all move to attack Alexander's cavalry, as he emerged from the river, lest they leave the path open for the remaining Macedonian forces to cross or come under attack themselves from the unengaged Macedonian troops. Alexander's cavalry sought to push their way out of the river, but the Persian cavalry attempted to push them back and keep the Macedonians in the water. The men of the Macedonian vanguard came off worst in their initial encounter and fell back on Alexander as he advanced. Alexander therefore led the Macedonian right wing combined with these remnants of the vanguard attack and charged directly towards the Persian commanders. Alexander's men, using cornel wood lances called the ziston, against the short javelins of the Persians, were eventually able to get the best of this encounter and push the Persians back from the riverbank. The Persian cavalry were pushed back by the Macedonian cavalry, who had by now been joined by light armed troops, the Agrianians and Peltasts. In Arrian, the Persian cavalry broke and fled, and Alexander now turned his attention towards the mercenary infantry, numbering almost 20,000, who stood firm where they had first been drawn up. In Diodorus, Alexander's attack was against less cavalry. Alexander brought his phalanx and cavalry down on the mercenaries, massacring all except 2,000 who were taken prisoner. These prisoners included a body of Athenians who were kept captive for some time, almost like hostages, in a bid to continue to keep the city of Athens compliant to Macedonian rule. In Plutarch, having crossed the river, the Macedonian phalanx engaged the Persian infantry forces. The Persian infantry soon fled the battlefield too, but the Greek mercenaries stood their ground and accounted for most of the losses suffered by the Macedonian phalanx in the battle. The desperate mercenaries asked for quarter, but this was refused. In Arrian, the Macedonian phalanx was only brought up against the Greek mercenaries. The rest of the Persian cavalry had already fled. Arrian's account would mean most of Alexander's phalanx was squandered, unable to attack, and therefore the battle, as described, was mainly a cavalry one. Diodorus tells us that with the Persian cavalry commanders slain, the Persian cavalry fled the scene, leaving the opposing infantry forces to do the battle. The Persian infantry, deeply affected by the rout of their cavalry counterparts, likewise soon fled. Another reason to favour the account in Diodorus is that his seems to better explain the incredibly low casualty numbers recorded. Even Plutarch and Arrian record these, but their accounts of the battle would make higher casualties seem far more likely. Arrian tells us that the Macedonians lost 25 companion cavalry in the first charge, and 60 more cavalry and approximately 30 infantry later. Plutarch quotes Aristobulus as saying there were only 34 Macedonian dead, 9 of whom were infantrymen, the remaining 25 according with Arrian's number of the companions who fell. Justin, another source who is sometimes useful, tells us that only 9 infantry and 120 cavalry fell on the Macedonian side. His numbers agree partially with the other sources. Diodorus does not specify the Macedonian casualty numbers. It is, however, hard to reconcile the low Macedonian casualty numbers recorded by Arrian and Plutarch with the ferocity of the hail of missiles into which both orders have Alexander charge. By contrast, Persian casualties across all sources are noted as having been very high. Arrian records that 1,000 Persian cavalry and almost 18,000 infantry perished. 2,000 infantry were taken prisoner. Plutarch reports 2,500 Persian cavalry and 20,000 infantry were killed. Plutarch has more infantry casualties almost than Arrian has infantry present at the battle. Diodorus records 2,000 Persian cavalry and 10,000 infantry dead, along with 20,000 prisoners. The low numbers of Macedonian casualties do not accord with the hard fighting mentioned by Arrian and Plutarch, but they do seem to fit with Diodorus's account of Alexander crossing the Granicus at dawn before the Persians could deploy and then fighting the battle on the Persian side of the river. If Alexander's men were stuck in the river trying to fight their way out even for a short amount of time, we would expect there to be many more Macedonian casualties. Diodorus's relatively low figure of 10,000 Persian infantry casualties does, however, make sense if the Persian infantry fled soon after being engaged by the Macedonians and already having seen their own cavalry flee. The numbers of Persian casualties in all Alexander's battles are always unbelievably high, no doubt to awe readers with the overwhelming and crushing nature of Alexander's victories. At the Granicus, the way Arrian and Plutarch describe it, Alexander was abandoning nearly all that was proven to work in the Macedonian military machine developed by Philip and then honed under him and his son Alexander. They have the young king trying to achieve victory with the hammer of his cavalry alone. That is highly unlikely as a scenario. Alexander simply did not have enough cavalry with which to effect such tactics, especially if he was charging a force so superior in numbers. His 13 squadrons, Plutarch's figure, would only amount to around 2,500 men, with 200 men per cavalry squadron, yet he was charging 10,000 or 20,000 Persian cavalry. Alexander only had 4,000 to 5,000 cavalry in total, and even if he was charging only the leftmost Persian units, he was still outnumbered. If we accept Alexander's cavalry charge in Diodorus's account against a force of only 10,000 cavalry, we restore the norms of the proven Macedonian tactics. If this was done with infantry support as described by Arrian, the norms of Chaeronea and Alexander's subsequent battles are shown to have been used at the Granicus too. Diodorus states that even though Alexander's personal conduct at the Granicus earned him the palm for bravery, the Thessalian cavalry on the Macedonian left wing earned a great reputation for valour. The scale of the Macedonian victory at the Granicus is made more probable if Alexander's entire army was indeed brought to bear on a numerically superior force. Plutarch does not mention the numbers of Persian infantry, but records that 20,000 of them were killed. Arrian mentions that the Persians only had foreign mercenaries and that they numbered slightly less than 20,000. It would seem highly unlikely, however, that the Persians would decide to engage the Macedonians when they were outnumbered in infantry, even if they were intending to decide the battle in a cavalry engagement. The threat of the Macedonian infantry makes it unlikely they would do so when their numbers were only evenly matched. Plutarch's mingling of infantry with cavalry on the riverbank seems the best solution, especially if the attack was made when they were relatively unprepared. We should reject Arrian's number of less than 20,000 Persian infantry. Likewise, Justin's figure of 600,000 infantry seems too many. Diodorus's 100,000 is within the proportions by which the Persians outnumbered the Macedonians at the later battles of both Issus and Gaugamela. We should be confident that the Persians outnumbered the Macedonians in both infantry and cavalry. The presence of overwhelming Persian infantry would have meant that the satraps outnumbered Alexander and were therefore confident of victory. They would no doubt have expected such a large army to put up a much better resistance to Alexander's infantry, which numbered at most 40,000 foot soldiers of all types. Regardless of how the Battle of Granicus was fought in 334 BC, the outcome was a victory for Alexander and his Macedonians, and they began their winning way in the conquest of the Persian Empire. What would follow was a decade of successful warfare where Alexander and his army would not lose a single battle. Thanks once again, Murray, for writing that episode for us. If you'd like to have a go at writing an episode for us, or you want to contact us and give us an idea for a subject that you think we've not covered yet, then just drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org for that. And once again, please do consider becoming a patron of the podcast at patreon.com/The History Network. Once again, thank you to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, written by Murray Darm, read by Nick Barker.